The mast was growing weak. Peter could see cracks appearing in the metal surface, along the edges of a growing bend near the base. It needed time and care, both things he couldn't afford to give it just yet. It had been several days now since the incident at the lab, several days of looking over his shoulder, wondering when the hammer would fall, several days of pushing the scale to the limit as he fought to cover as much ground as possible. Peter was tired. He was ready to drop and wait for the terrifying Dr. Chuckles to catch up and do as he pleased with him. "Hey!" The voice of Stu the Shrew cut through Peter's thoughts and pulled him back to the moment. "Look, up there in the sky!" That moment was a rodent-sized campsite, built around a crude fire pit fashioned from small pebbles, and overshadowed by a sailing vehicle built from a modified roller skate. It was just off the main highway of the Great Apes, a vast, seemingly endless road populated mainly by travelers in their howling steel machines, and, of course, to a little caravan of mice, a rat, a shrew, and a spider. A lonely tree rose from the dry, sandy soil, accompanied by a short, fat, but sparsely leafed bush. The world was flat and hot here. One could look straight forward and see the pale blue sky descend to meet the ground. The only clouds were distant, high and wispy, and the sun was bright and strong. There came a low grumble as one of those mice raised his head and looked towards the sky. A hulking, hairless brute by the name of Jeremiah Marsh, who wore a cloak the dark green color of the eyes of a lost love, and answered only to the nickname of Monster.
"What? It's a bird."
"Nah," Stu disagreed. "I say it's a plane." A small gray lump plummeted into the fire, sending a burst of flame flaring up on impact. Stu held his sensitive nose as a noxious fume emanated from the campfire. "Y'all was right. It's a bird." Peter straightened up from where he stood on the scale, squinting into the sunlight as he watched the approaching black dot. "Columbia livia domestica, if I'm not mistaken, otherwise known as the city pigeon."
"Take cover!"
Monster roared. The huge mouse dove into a nearby bush, followed shortly by Stu. Hundreds of soft pellets pelted the ground, kicking up plumes of sand and upsetting the twigs on the fire. Peter took shelter under the scale, just in time to avoid a white-gray splatter across the shiny metal surface. Peter sighed, looking up into the 8 glistening black eyes of Matrix, his longtime friend and companion, who just then had hidden on the scale's underside as well. At least Bess wasn't here for this. Elizabeth Hartley, a pretty, by mouse standards, little schoolmarm without a school, was at that moment foraging for food with Ben, a former lab mouse she had adopted several days prior as a foster son. Albeit a foster son large and strong enough to level most other mice with a single punch. Above the scale there came a sound of fluttering and chortling as the pigeon descended to the ground.
"Pardon me, Mac. Every time I see something shiny on the ground, I just gotta take a shot."
Peter poked his head out from under the scale, glancing towards the sky and then turning his attention to the pigeon on the ground.
"Well, bless my soul. Is that you, Skyrat?" "Peter Dane," the pigeon squawked. "So here you are. I ain't seen you since the big cheese incident last summer."
Peter emerged from under the scale, extending one arm for Matrix to crawl along on the way to his shoulder.
"I say, you're rather far from home."
Yeah, about that," Skyrat added, lifting a leg.
"I've been looking for you. Got a delivery with your name on it."
Strapped to the leg was a small tube with a roll of paper within.
"Pretty lady rat sent it. Really wanted you to get it, Pete."
And unrolling it, read the note written within, a curious eyebrow raised.
"What did I say, huh?"
Skyrat chuckled, nudging Peter in the side with a wink.
"Hot night's coming, eh?"
Peter glanced back up at Skyrat with a suspicious eye.
"About when did you get this?"
Skyrat shrugged.
"About a week ago. Why?"
Peter rolled up the note and tucked it into his jacket.
"Thank you, old friend. I'll see to it from here." "Hey, what? No tip?"
"I've got nothing to offer," Peter answered curtly. "Only gratitude."
"Well, gratitude's nice and all, but it don't pay the bar tab, you know."
Peter's expression suddenly hardened.
Off with you! Perhaps next time we meet I'll have something for you.
Skyrat gulped.
Okay, Mac. No reason to get mad about it.
In a rush of wings, the pigeon lifted into the air and faded away into the distance. Stu poked his head out from the bush.
What was that all about?
Peter, however, had turned his attention back to the scale, rubbing his chin in thought as he looked it over. Matrix squeaked. Peter set a hand on the scale and shooed Matrix down from his shoulder with the other. Hopping up, he bent down near the mast, staring at the weakening base. Monster emerged from the bush, raising a curious eyebrow as he watched.
What is it?
Peter looked up into the expectant faces of Monster and Stu.
When base gets back, we're turning around.
Stu blinked.
Why?
Peter's brow furrowed as he regarded the weakening mast for a time longer. Stu nudged Monster in the side.
Did he hear me? Peter,
Monster barked.
Why are we turning back? And where are we going?
Peter looked up at Monster with an uncharacteristic scowl.
Home.
Peter worked throughout the morning. Sparks flew as he took to the mast with a mouse-sized blowtorch, melting down sections and reinforcing the weakened base with bits of scrap metal he kept tucked away for a rainy day. When asked where he got his tool from, Peter simply motioned to Matrix. Where the spider had gotten it was anyone's guess. It was around noon when Elizabeth and Ben returned. Elizabeth carried a bundle of wild roots and tubers in her little red cloak. Ben, meanwhile, was limited to carrying a pile of seeds and nuts in his arms, a trail of lost food stretching back behind him.
"Lunch!"
Elizabeth announced. She paused, waiting while Stu and Monster watched Peter as if transfixed. Elizabeth blinked.
"Come and get it before I eat it all."
Elizabeth's stomach punctuated her remark with a loud growl of approval. Stu glanced over his shoulder and nudged Monster in the side.
Chow time! Let's go!
"Peter?"
Elizabeth added.
Have Ben save me a bite,
Peter answered, holding the mast in both hands.
The metal needs time to harden.
Elizabeth blinked and glanced to Stu and Monster.
"What's going on?"
Stu shrugged.
Search me! He got a message this morning, and then he just started working.
Monster nodded.
There's something troubling him. He insisted on waiting for you to return before he told us.
"Well, here I am."
Elizabeth called out to Peter.
"What's the matter?"
Soon, Peter called back.
"Soon? What?"
I shall be with you shortly. Until then, I need to keep the mast upright.
Elizabeth turned back to the others and shrugged.
"I guess he'll be with us shortly."
The three mice and the shrew gathered to eat in the scale's shadow. The meal was far from appetizing. Fortunately, the dry plant flesh and tasteless seeds were enough to stifle even Elizabeth's legendary appetite, and that was quite the achievement. By the time Peter appeared satisfied with the mast's progress, there was still a fair pile of food left.
"Now,
Elizabeth addressed Peter as he skulked by.
would you mind telling us what has you so perturbed?"
Peter sat down, taking a large bite of a tuber and chewed quietly for a time. Matrix scuttled up his back onto the rat's head and peered down into Peter's eyes. When the rat swallowed, he paused for a moment, as if preparing a long, intense speech. Then he took another bite and went on chewing away.
I don't think he's saying nothing,
Stu remarked.
The big cheese is dead,
Peter finally announced. Ben blinked. A big cheese? Is that good to eat?
He was a muskrat living in the sewers,
Monster explained, fingering the edge of his halberd.
Had himself a little rat mafia working for him,
Stu added. Elizabeth nodded.
"Peter got on his bad side when I ate all his cheese."
Ben scratched his head. Cheese? Eating cheese? Would that be cannibalism? Monster hit Ben over the head.
He wasn't cheese. He was a muskrat called Big Cheese, as in the boss.
Ben glanced to Elizabeth, a look of intense awe in his eyes. And you ate him? Elizabeth shook her head.
No. Peter helped me hide from the rat mob, and the hiding place was on a shelf full of cheese. The big cheese and his rats had been using the store of cheese for a food source, And when I ate it all, the great apes got suspicious and set traps, making the cheese impossible to reach."
Ben was silent for a moment. I'm confused." There came a sound of Peter forcefully clearing his throat, drawing the three mice's attention back to him.
"The point is, the big cheese is dead. Without him to enforce order, the streets have descended into chaos."
Drawing the roll of paper from his jacket, Peter added,
"This note was sent by a former contact of mine from my days in the city, one Charles Vincetti."
And that pigeon said he got the note from a lady rat," Stu added. "Does that mean—"
Peter nodded.
"We have at least one other contact in the mix."
Stu squinted and made a face.
"Actually, I thought y'all was gonna say Chubby Charlie sent it out dressed in drag."
Stu shuddered at the thought of it.
"Dang it! Now why'd y'all have to put that image in my poor old head? I did not need that."
Monster rolled his eyes in disgust.
"You have no one to blame but yourself, shrew."
Elizabeth, however, was more concerned with Peter's part in all this.
"What does this mean for you? Surely you won't be going back. Every rat in the city has it in for you."
Peter nodded.
"Indeed, but Mr. Vincetti was always good to me. Even at the end, I suspect he would have gladly let me go, given the chance."
Peter fell silent for a time as he gazed down at the note.
"I owe it to him. I have to go back."
Looking back up at the others, he added,
"If anyone objects, you don't have to come with. This is personal for me."
Elizabeth took the first step forward, setting her hand on Peter's arm.
"I'm the reason you had to leave. I want to make it up to you now."
Peter sighed.
"Bess, you already have. Several times over."
Elizabeth cocked her head to one side, giving Peter a coy look.
"Nevertheless, I am coming with you."
Monster grunted, rising to his feet.
"Elizabeth Hartley, I go where you go."
Stu heaved a sigh.
"Well, ditto, I guess. I'm in."
"Yeah," Ben agreed. "Me too." He fell silent as the others simultaneously glanced in his direction.
"Do you know what you're getting into?"
Elizabeth asked. Ben shrugged. "No idea, but it couldn't be worse than getting left alone out here."
"He's got a point,"
Stu remarked. Matrix agreed, tapping the sides of Peter's head. Peter finally cracked the rudimentary beginning of a smile as he met the spider's gaze.
"It would appear I have a crew, then. Very well. Let us be off. This note is a number of days old, and I doubt things have improved in that time."
Monster pulled the scale out into the road, while the others climbed aboard and grabbed a hold of the various knobs and bars Peter had installed nearly a year ago, things to make the scale's rapid travel safer and more stable. With the scale in position, Peter pulled a cord, lowering the sail and dropping a pair of magnetic counterweights which clung to the metal deck. A pair of extensions rose on either side of the mast, spreading the sail even further to catch more of the wind. Unfortunately, there was no wind that day. Peter paused for a moment in thought. Then a light appeared to go on in his head.
"Monster, I'll need you to take the reins."
By reins, Peter referred to a pair of cords hanging from either end of the mast's extensions. Normally, Peter used these to steer the scale when it was in motion. Monster moved to the rear of the scale, the position where Peter normally stood, and taking the reins, leaned back and dug in his heels as he braced himself for takeoff. Peter glanced around for a moment before his gaze settled on Stu. The shrew looked back up at Peter uneasily.
"What? Something on my nose or in my whiskers?"
Peter hooked his toes under a pair of handles and lifted Stu right off the deck and held the shrew in front of the sail. Then he pumped Stu's legs like a bellows. In and out the shrew's breath pulsed. The sail filled and billowed out, and just like that, they were off. Monster chuckled aloud.
"I always knew you were full of hot air."
All through the day and into the night the crew of rodents rode, speeding along the highway at speeds undreamed of by mouse or rat. When a strong wind picked up at their backs, Peter only pumped harder, while exhausted Stu's eyes bulged with every breath. A previous week's worth of countryside flew by in a matter of hours, By nightfall, Peter was still going strong, a steely look in his eyes as he gazed past the ragged shrew to the road beyond. He likely would have kept up the pressure until morning had Elizabeth not raised her voice in concern.
Peter!
She shouted over the rush of wind.
Stu needs a rest!
The shrew nodded, the wind rushing from his mouth in erratic spurts with the motion. Peter blinked at the sound of a voice outside his mind. Glancing down at Stu, he realized it was true. The shrew's face had turned a bright red that shone through even his thick black fur.
"Monster!" Peter called out. "Bring us 3 degrees to starboard."
3 degrees to what?
"Oh, of course. To the right, Monster. 3 degrees to the right."
Monster grumbled under his breath, but whatever his words might have been, they were lost to the howling wind. Very slightly, the scale tilted to the right, and began a long, slow drift towards the edge of the road as the vehicle's considerable momentum spent itself. A final, steady grind to a halt brought the scale to the very edge of the highway. Stu gasped as he dropped to the deck.
Stop the ride! I want to get off!
Peter felt dizzy as the day's steady supply of adrenaline slowed to a crawl. He became keenly aware of the conditions of his friends. Stu splayed on his back, Elizabeth and Ben stretching and rubbing their aching fingers. Even Monster appeared to have suffered some consequence from the long haul. The moment he released the reins, he winced as his blistered palms met the cool night air. About the only one among them who did not appear the worse for wear was Matrix, who just then was staring at Peter, his arachnid face inscrutable, but his posture was one of indignation. The spider had crossed a pair of limbs over his chest, another pair resting against the spider's equivalent of hips, and was tapping a rear limb against Peter's shoulder, as if asking if the rat had anything to say for himself. Peter gulped as he regarded each of them in turn.
"I'm sorry. I'm so very terribly sorry."
Don't mention it,
Stu groaned, rubbing his aching ribs. Peter fell silent. He climbed down from the scale and slipped away into the brush at the side of the road. "Should someone go after him?" Ben asked. Elizabeth shook her head.
Someone already has.
Indeed, someone had, and they were riding on Peter's shoulder at that very moment. When Peter sat down in the shade of a sparse, round bush, Matrix crawled onto one of the surrounding branches and spun a dense little web not unlike a spider-sized hammock. Settling in for a night's rest, he then looked down at Peter and watched the rat. Peter hollowed out a small opening in the sand just under a clump of woody stems, and hanging his tweed jacket, vest, and cap from a handy twig, curled up in the little hole.
"What am I doing?"
Peter blurted out. Matrix shrugged.
"I never bothered with the street rats before. What little I did was just to keep them off my back."
"Uh-huh."
"So what does it matter? What becomes of them?" Peter paused in thought. "Mr. Vincetti must have been desperate to contact me."
"Uh-huh," Matrix agreed with a light nod.
"Regardless, it's not worth losing my mind over, or running the others ragged now, is it?"
"Uh-uh." Peter rolled onto his back and looked up at the spider's shadow.
"What would you do, lad?"
Matrix paused for a moment, rubbing his fangs. Then he began chittering away, quite passionately for a spider, gesturing wildly with his 4 forelimbs, then raising a magnifying glass to his front right eye with one limb and a little pistol with the other, while saluting the moon with a third and playing a harmonica with a fourth. At last, Matrix looked back down at Peter and concluded, "Oh." Peter rubbed his chin and nodded.
"Yes, I believe I will. Thank you, Matrix. That was most illuminating."
The following morning, as Elizabeth stretched and rubbed the sleep from her eyes, she looked about and saw that Peter had yet to return. Monster was already up and about, patrolling the perimeter of their camp. Stu and Ben, meanwhile, continued to snore away.
"Monster!"
she called, waving the big mouse over. Monster raised an eyebrow, picking up on her concern.
"Have you seen Peter?"
Monster shook his head.
Not since last night.
Elizabeth furrowed her brow, rubbing her chin in thought.
"I see."
Want me to find him?
Elizabeth shook her head.
"No, not yet. I think he was a bit embarrassed after that long haul. He'll probably be back when he's ready.
Or he'll strike out on his own,
Monster suggested.
I don't think so. He wouldn't get far without the scale. I think he'll be back. We just need to give him time.
Elizabeth looked down, holding her stomach as it began to growl and rumble.
For now, let's see if we can dig up some breakfast. If today is anything like yesterday, we'll need to keep our strength up.
Monster grunted, nodding.
Should I go on the hunt?
Elizabeth restrained an intense grimace as she pictured Monster's prey of choice. Oversized arachnids like centipedes and tarantulas, or large, fat annelids such as leeches. Shaking her head, she answered,
No, I think I'll take Ben out to forage. He's been getting pretty good at it.
As you wish,
Monster grumbled. He made no effort to hide his pleasure. Monster had actually been dreading the thought of hunting in this wasteland, and he was in no mood to risk his life matching wits with ambush predators like trapdoor spiders, assuming he could find one. Also, there was something about the sight of Elizabeth squirming that he found faintly amusing. Not as amusing as Stu, perhaps, but worth a smirk nonetheless. On their way out to forage, Elizabeth took Ben down Peter's trail from the previous night. She found the little hollow where he had slept, but Peter and Matrix were long gone by now. Throughout the morning, as Elizabeth and Ben nosed and rooted about, she occasionally spotted the large telltale tracks of a passing rat, and occasionally found a twig or stick that had been bent and tied into an odd position, but Peter himself was nowhere to be found. Upon her return, Elizabeth and Ben shared a light breakfast of roots and tubers, much like the previous day. Each bite mashed and munched like clay in Elizabeth's mouth, and sat in her stomach like a boulder. But it was something, and her stomach soon stopped complaining. Monster and Stu appeared more appreciative of the morning's take, munching away quite content. Ben, meanwhile, barely noticed the difference between a tuber and the food pellets he was accustomed to. The remainder of the morning was spent stretching out in the scale's shade, while Stu dug a hole in search of a cooler place to rest. The sun had risen high in the sky when the sound of heaving and grunting reached Elizabeth's ears. Peter appeared, a pair of rough metal rods across his shoulders, and a most unusual contraption attached to them. At the front stood a small wheel, with 3 sticks attached at odd angles and bent backwards on themselves, a single thread of silk holding them in their new positions. The inside of the curve was then filled in with sheets of silk, similar to miniature sails. Another, even stranger contraption rode behind the first, elevated slightly, and attached to the same pair of metal rods. 4 pairs of eyes watched as Peter hauled the odd form towards the scale. At last, Peter let his load fall, stretched his back, and sighed. Ben and Stu exchanged curious glances.
"Good morrow, my friends," Peter greeted. "I say, Monster, might you help me load this up?"
Monster blinked.
What is it?
Peter looked back at his creation.
"Oh, of course, I suppose it does merit some explanation. Well, the short of it is, it's my way of making amends to Stu. Once we get it in place, I'll no longer need to pump him for wind."
Stu heaved a sigh of relief at the suggestion. Monster eyed the odd machine for a time.
How does it work?
"Ah, yes. Well, it starts with this wheel towards the back," Peter explained. "You slip your feet into these pedals right here. They rotate the wheel, and this connected chain, you see, which in turn—"
Monster rubbed his forehead with a low groan.
Enough! I'll take your word for it.
Peter paused a moment, gathering his thoughts.
"The point is, the key part is this set of blades toward the front."
Those are blades?
Monster grumbled, looking at the bent twigs.
They don't look like they could cut anything, except thin air.
"Which is exactly the point," Peter added. "They cut the air like a fan, creating a breeze, which shall serve to power the scale."
Monster glanced to the new machine and back to Peter, clearly unconvinced.
I'll take your word for it.
"Now, if you'll help me," Peter concluded, grabbing onto one of the metal bars, "take the other one, like so. Now, we must simply align them with the scale's handles, like so.
There were 2 pairs of handles in the middle of the scale, like squarish arches, paired 2 by 2. With Monster's help, Peter maneuvered his fan's metal bars through these arches so that they could help hold it in place. "Now then," Peter announced. "Matrix! I'll blowtorch!" The spider nodded, handing Peter a canister producing a narrow blue flame. Where exactly he got it from, or where he kept it when not in use, was a mystery. With that tool in hand, Peter started his work, melting the metal bars into the scale's surface to keep them from slipping. Not long after, Peter stood up, and twisting a valve, shut the flame off. "Finished! We shall have to let the metal cool, but we should be off within the hour." Peter was as good as his word. When the crew set off that afternoon, Peter sat at the head of the scale, pedaling away, propelling the vehicle forward, while Monster took up his position in the back, steering. When Peter grew tired, the 2 switched places. Thus they proceeded through the day and the night, stopping only to let the others rest their fingers. Still, this was preferable to the previous stretch, in which Peter had worn Stu to a frazzle. It was late in the night when Elizabeth and her friends arrived at their destination. Peter made a point of camping out during the prior day, waiting for the sun to set and the great apes to return to their dwellings to sleep. Under cover of darkness, the scale rolled into town, unseen by rat or ape. On Peter's command, Monster pulled into a gas station parking lot, the very one he, Elizabeth, and Stu had hidden in nearly a year ago, and hid the scale behind a very familiar ice machine. Stu held his ears as the machine's rumbling shook his very skull.
"Dang, and here I'd convinced myself it wasn't that bad."
Peter muttered, rubbing his chin. "I had planned to have the rest of you hide out here while Matrix and I scouted ahead."
"Nothing doing," Stu quipped. "I am not spending a day here again."
"I see," Peter mused. After a moment, a light flickered on behind his eyes, and he snapped his fingers. "If I recall correctly, there should be a dumpster around the side of the building. You could hide there instead. I expect it will be much quieter." Elizabeth, Monster, and Stu exchanged sheepish glances. Elizabeth emerged from behind the ice machine and poked her head around the corner of the building. Looking back, she nodded to the others. "He's right!"
He's right.
Stu quickly joined her, a look of irritated disbelief written across his face.
"Dang, now why didn't we think of this last time?"
"We didn't have a guide," Monster grumbled, "and we weren't accustomed to the city."
Elizabeth motioned for Ben to follow them. "I'll send for you," Peter called after them, "once I've gotten the lay of the land." "Is this really a good idea?" Ben asked. "I mean, if the other rats really hate him, like you've said, shouldn't he have someone watching his back?"
He does,
Elizabeth answered, remembering how she first met Matrix. The spider had scared off a creepy little mouse and then trapped a rat in a cocoon, thus rescuing Elizabeth and winning her trust. She also remembered her first meeting with Peter, his keen, analytical mind, and his silver tongue.
Peter's going to be all right. Have faith.
Peter, in the meantime, ducked into a gutter and, when the opportunity presented itself, darted across the street, making a beeline for the alley he once knew. There were great apes about, even at this hour, but their numbers were sparse, out here and there on the sidewalk under the streetlights, and the occasional drunk slumped in a dark corner of an alley. What Peter did not see, much to his surprise, however, were rats and mice. As he peered up at the fire escapes and nosed about behind trash cans and dumpsters, he found the once teeming alley mysteriously empty. Peter raised his nose and sniffed the air for the telltale scent of Felidae. Yet there were no cats either. So Peter darted across the alley to investigate a small, squarish bulge to a great ape in the side of a building. Around a corner, hidden away from sight, hung a little metal sign, its letters warped and shaped into the form of a rat's head wearing a fedora and smoking a cigar. "Mr. Biggs," it read. Mr. Biggs had once been among Peter's great contributions to the Big Cheese's mob of rats, a rodent-sized bar, tavern, and burlesque of Peter's design. He had taught the other rats how to read his blueprints and build the parts necessary to assemble the place. The entrance was little more than a chink in the brickwork to a great ape. It was large enough, however, for a rat to walk through quite comfortably. As Peter stepped into the entryway, he was greeted with the familiar, thick scent of cigar smoke. And something else. Mingled with the smell of tobacco was a stench of rot and blood that was quite out of place. As Peter pushed past the curtain that served as an inner door, he was greeted with a sight more akin to a battlefield triage than the nightclub he thought he had built. Many of the tables had been shoved aside and piled one on top of the other to make room for rough cloths stretched across the floor, where wounded and dying rats lay in droves. The living and healthy variously occupied the remaining tables, the bar stools, and just stood about, either guzzling mugs of beer or tending to the wounded. A line of showgirls danced and sang on the stage, but their expressions were strained and forced. Peter slunk into a shadowy corner, lifting his arm to a wall for Matrix to scuttle up for a better view. He scanned the room, looking for familiar faces. As near as he could tell, Charles Vincetti wasn't around. He did, however, recognize a mouse at the bar with a lazy eye. Michael Lorry, or, as the rats called him when shouting and barking for service, Mickey the Towel. Then Peter felt the cold steel of a metal hook pressing under his chin. Glancing to the left, he spotted a muscular gray arm reaching around the edge of the doorway, beyond which lurked a malicious, grinning face under a black bowler.
"Welcome home, boyo!"
Willie Dawson to the ladies and Bill from the Bilge to everyone else, but not to his face, growled with a cruel leer. Matrix wiggled his rump as he prepared to pounce, yet as he leapt for the rat, Bill pulled his hook away, whipping it against the spider's underside and sending him sailing across the room with a squeal.
"Not this time, laddie!"
Bill spat. Then the hook returned to rest against Peter's throat.
"You've got some bloody gall coming back here after what you pulled."
The savage bilge rat emerged from the doorway, a silver chain slung across his chest, sparkling in the faint light. He wore a sleeveless black jacket, a pale skull and crossbones crudely painted across the back in stale whiteout.
"Oi!"
Bill shouted.
"Look who's back, boys! It's old Inventor McBrains!"
One set of eyes after another turned in Peter's direction. A bottle smashed, a rat brandishing it in Peter's direction. A knife clicked, a blade snapping forth to do violence. A spare table leg tapped against a meaty palm. Peter gulped, suddenly very conscious of his precarious position.
"I had heard there was some trouble, so you came bloody looking for it, eh?"
Bill sneered.
"You came to the right place, boyo."
A large crowd pressed in around them, sharp edges and blunt objects catching Peter's terrified eyes one after the other. Perhaps he should have brought someone else along. At least Monster could give this bunch a run for their money. Peter reached into his jacket, feeling for a few spare scraps of shrapnel. Perhaps he could scare back a few of them with some sharp edges of his own. Ultimately, however, that proved unnecessary. There was a rapid-fire series of gunshots. The music stopped, punctuated by the frightened squeals of showgirls ducking for cover, and the ring of bullets ricocheting off the walls, tables, the bar, and shattering the occasional glass. As one body, the other rats hit the floor.
"Lay off him, boys,"
a low, shaking, nasal voice rasped from the far corner.
"I want to see this famous Peter Dane for myself."
A faint wisp of smoke wafted from the end of a gun barrel across the room. The weapon lifted, nearly vertical, into the air, and came to rest against a shoulder clad in the torn remnants of what had once been a rat-sized, pinstriped suit. Dark, yellowed teeth chomped at a cigar, which glowed with stifled fire at the far end. The rat tipped back his fedora, revealing a black-furred face and a dull, ruddy scar torn across a bright red eye. He tipped his chair back against the nearest wall, crossing his legs over the table that sat just to the left of the stage. Peter stepped gingerly over the horizontal rats around him, and once he was clear, scurried over to meet his rescuer. "You have my thanks, sir. Your timing was impeccable."
"Good. Then we can talk about your thanks, Dane."
Peter fell silent. He didn't like this rat's tone, yet as he recognized the man's weapon, Peter became keenly aware he was in no position to argue. It was considerably smaller than the models Peter had seen in old movies, but there was no mistaking the distinct shape of the Thompson submachine gun, more commonly known as the street sweeper, Chicago typewriter, or simply Tommy gun.
"I don't believe we've met, Mr.
"Sure we have." The rat blew a ring of smoke in Peter's face, prompting a fit of coughs from the ex-lab rat.
"You just don't remember me, but I remember you."
The rat grinned.
"You were one of a kind, Pally. We still use some of your old claptraps now and then. Real good stuff, kid."
Kid? Peter was easily old enough to be this rat's great-grandfather. Not that he cared to point that out, though. It was a small enough detail to let slide.
"Well, I'm glad someone remembers the good I've done."
"I'm not interested in remembering," the rat answered. "I want you back, see? I want more from you."
Peter fell silent for a moment.
"I only came back to help Mr. Vincetti. I have no intention of lingering."
A cold gleam entered the other rat's eye. He swung his legs over the side of the table and leaned forward.
"What do you want with Chubby Charlie?"
Peter's stomach sank and twisted into knots, but he could feel his resolve hardening.
"I received a message asking for my help. Can you tell me where he is?"
Peter pulled the note from his jacket and set it on the table. The other rat didn't even look at it.
"Sure, Pally, I'll tell you where he is."
Bullets sprayed into the ceiling as the rat hopped to his feet and pelted the bar in a horizontal hail as he lowered his weapon. Then the rat jammed the smoking barrel up Peter's nose and spoke in an icy rasp.
"That's where he is, see? Singing with the angels."
"I see,"
Peter remarked, locking eyes with his host.
"Then there's no reason for me to stay."
"Sure there is,"
the rat answered, his teeth baring in an eager grin.
"If you want to keep breathing. Only way you leave is in a body bag. You work for me now, see?"
Peter eyed the rat's gun. Rodents capable of producing even rudimentary firearms were rare, the most advanced model he could recall having been Chubby Charlie's shotgun. Something of this caliber was unheard of. Glancing back up at his new boss, Peter nodded.
"Yes, I see."
The rat leaned back, raising the gun toward the ceiling.
"And just a friendly warning. You're either with me or Doc Chuck. And if you're with Doc Chuck, you're dead, see?"
Peter's brow furrowed.
"No, I don't see. Who is this Doc Chuck?"
The rat blinked in disbelief.
"What, you don't know?"
"All I know is that the big cheese is dead, and the streets have fallen into chaos."
The rat leaned forward, raising a suspicious eyebrow.
"Doc Chuck killed the big cheese, right in his own home. Knocked over all his statues and left him for the flies."
Peter felt lightheaded.
"This Doc Chuck fellow, what can you tell me about him?"
The rat shrugged.
"I thought he was Chubby Charlie. Doc Chuck, Doc Charlie, you know? I figured when I bumped off the Chubs, that'd be the end of Doc Chuck. End of story, end of war, and the fat lady sings, see?"
Peter glanced across the room to the wounded and dying rats stretched out on the floor.
"It would appear you were mistaken."
Looking back at the other rat, Peter added,
"I didn't catch your name."
"'Cause I didn't give it, see?"
The rat extended a hand.
"Eddie G."
Peter stared at the hand for a time and then recoiled into his chair. Eddie G, far from being angry, appeared immensely pleased at this reaction. The hand rose from the table and patted Peter's cheek, accompanied with a low chuckle.
"Smart boy."
Peter's skin crawled at Eddie G's touch.
"Was there something in particular you wanted me to build?"
Eddie G shrugged.
"I'll think of something. For the moment, it's enough you're not joining up with Doc Chuck."
Eddie G looked away from Peter, eyes zeroing in on the silent stage.
"What, do I pay you to just sit on your cute little heinies and do nothing? Get out here and dance for the boys."
A black rat and light brown mouse woman peered out from the edges of the stage. The rat then motioned for the other women to join them. Their smiles were forced and strained as a line of rat women began an awkward dance, and several mice broke out into song. A haggard-looking rat crawled out from cover and began playing a jaunty tune on the piano to accompany the song and dance.
Hey!
Eddie G. barked towards the entrance.
What's an act without an audience? Get yourselves off the floor and show 'em some love.
Peter raised an eyebrow as he noted the angry mob that had attacked him earlier, still flat on the floor, covering their heads. One by one, they peered out from behind their fingers and dispersed towards the remaining tables and stools. Several returned to the sides of the wounded and dying. Mickey the Towel peered over the side of the bar, his lazy eye swiveling madly as it scanned the room, his normal eye remaining fixed on Eddie G. Peter didn't like what he saw. Even under the big cheese, one didn't cross the city rats. But then, at least the rodent mob was still a bit more relaxed in those days. Now it was as though even the thugs were walking on eggshells.
What? You got a problem with my style?
Peter glanced back to Eddie G. He shrugged.
I haven't decided. The streets were dangerous in my day. Perhaps they're safer with your men on a short leash. But I have to wonder, just how loyal are they to you if you rule by fear?
No one wants to die, Pete,
Eddie G. retorted. He tapped his gun in his free palm for emphasis.
If they have to choose me or death, they'll choose me.
Unless death becomes preferable, Peter muttered.
Eddie G.'s brow furrowed, and the cigar sagged from his mouth.
What's that supposed to mean, eh?
Peter locked eyes with Eddie G.
It means you're walking a dangerous line. Fear can only get you so far.
Eddie G. scowled coldly at Peter, cigar rising as he clenched his teeth together.
Well, what do you suggest, genius? I change their diapers and tuck 'em into bed with a cup of warm milk?
Peter didn't dignify the remark with a response, instead opting to change the subject to a more immediate concern.
Am I free to go, or am I some sort of prisoner?
What?
Eddie G. exclaimed.
Where would you go, eh? To Doc Chuck?
Peter shook his head.
No, that is one place I don't believe I would dare go. Nothing to do with your fancy gun, sir.
You two got a past or something?
Peter shrugged.
It's only a hunch. I hope it's wrong.
Eddie G. sighed and rolled his eyes.
All right, fine. You can walk around, hit the town, whatever.
Suddenly aiming his weapon at Peter, Eddie G. added,
But if I find out you crossed me...
You won't, Peter cut him off. He stood up, sliding his chair back in, and turned away. Matrix hopped down from his perch, scuttling up Peter's back to settle on his shoulder. Peter set off across the room, intent on the exit. A number of angry glares flashed his way as he passed one rat or another, but none dared lay a finger on him. Rather like the old days, Peter mused.